His army was shattered, morale in tatters. Julius Caesar was trapped in Greece, completely isolated. He was outnumbered, outsupplied, and his veteran legions had just been defeated by Pompey. This should have been his end. Tornacha, but the decisive battle wasn't about numbers. It was about a secret hidden line of 3,000 men and one brilliant, unconventional order. This is the story of how cunning, discipline, and a single perfect trap decided the fate of Rome. It was the culmination of a year of relentless campaigning, a high-stakes gamble that had begun with a single, irreversible act of defiance. The Roman Senate, august and terrified, had watched Caesar's shadow lengthen from Gaul. They had heard of his victories, his unbreakable bond with his men, and they feared his ambition. So they issued an ultimatum, a demand for him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, ready to be tried. Caesar's response was not with a letter, but with the full force of his legions. In the previous video, we saw how Caesar refused to be tried by the Roman Senate, which declared him an enemy of Rome. The civil war had not just begun, it had exploded. The Senate, in its panic, turned to the only man they believed could match Caesar's military genius, Pompey the Great. They gave him a singular mandate: defend Italy, defend the Republic. But Caesar's advance was not a conventional march. It was a thunderbolt. He moved with a speed that defied logistics, defied weather, defied reason. Sixtor, town after town fell to him, often without a fight, charmed or cowed by his presence. Pompey, the great general, the hero of the East, found himself wrong-footed, his legions scattered, his preparations incomplete. He was forced to make a humiliating, yet strategically sound decision. After Caesar's rapid advance, he was forced to flee to Greece. He abandoned Italy, abandoned Rome itself to his rival. From the moment Pompey's ships cleared the harbor at Brundisium, the Roman civil war had truly begun. Once Pompey fled to Greece, Julius Caesar had a free hand to enter Rome and plan his next moves. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, though the treasury was swiftly emptied to fund his war. He was master of Italy, but he was not master of the Republic. Pompey, now in Greece, was in his own heartland of power, a region where his name commanded immense loyalty and resources. Caesar, ever the strategist, looked at the map of the world and saw two fires he must extinguish. Pompey's troops were focused on Greece, where the general himself was rallying the eastern kingdoms. But he also had a massive, battle-hardened army still active in the west, 7 legions in Hispania. These legions were a dagger aimed at Caesar's back, capable of invading Gaul or Italy the moment he turned his attention to Greece. This presented Caesar with a dilemma. It was a question that would define the rest of the war. Was it better to go to Greece, to strike at the head of the snake and finish off Pompey before he became stronger? Or was it better to end his dominance in Hispania, to secure the West and consolidate his power, and then move on to Greece? Many of his officers argued for a direct assault on Pompey. To allow Pompey time was to allow him to build a force that could overwhelm them. But Caesar saw the long game. After much thought, Caesar opted for the second option. He would deal with the body before he struck at the head. He moved with his characteristic speed. With the help of his legions in Gaul, he headed towards Hispania. The campaign in Hispania was not a simple matter. It was a grueling, difficult war of maneuver and engineering. Caesar's men were pushed to their limits, cut off from supplies and facing experienced commanders. But Caesar's genius was not just in battle, it was in logistics and siege work. He managed to trap Pompey's troops, divert their water source, and wear them down without a full-scale, bloody confrontation. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Ilerda, where 5 of Pompey's legions surrendered to Caesar. In a single brilliant campaign, he had neutralized the entire Western threat. He had secured his rear. Once he had control of Hispania, he decided to head for Greece. But while Caesar had been occupied in Hispania, Pompey had not been idle. In the meantime, Pompeius had taken advantage of the time to swell his army, recruiting troops throughout the eastern Mediterranean. He was by name and reputation the master of the East. Kings and client states sent him men, money, and ships. His forces grew to a monstrous size, dwarfing Caesar's small veteran army. Pompey now commanded a formidable fleet that controlled the seas and an army of immense proportions. He was ready and he was confident. After pacifying Hispania, Caesar returned to Rome. He paused briefly to stabilize the political situation, having himself declared consul on January 1st, 48. His power was now legally, if not universally, recognized. But the consulship was a means to an end. The war was waiting. 3 days later, just 3 days into his new office, he set sail for Greece. The speed was breathtaking. Almost exactly a year had passed since he had crossed the Rubicon. A year of improbable victories, a year that had seen him conquer Italy and Hispania. Now the final act was to begin. Although sailing at that time, in the dead of winter, would have been highly dangerous, Caesar took the risk. In March, the winter gales of the Adriatic were notorious. But Caesar knew that Pompey's fleet, commanded by Bibulus, would be less vigilant, believing no one would be mad enough to attempt a crossing. Caesar's gamble paid off, but only in part.
He made it across the sea undetected. This is a massive initial victory. However, only in part.
There was a problem. The very speed of his operation had created a critical weakness. He did not have enough ships to transport his entire army. He had, at best, capacity for only half of his forces. A more cautious general would have waited, gathered more transports, and crossed with his full strength in the spring. But Caesar was not a cautious general. Muerder, he decided to divide his army. He would take the first half across himself, establish a beachhead, and then send the ships back for the second half, which was waiting in Italy under the command of Mark Antony. Across the first half of Caesar's army crossed without incident. They landed in Epirus, a shore hostile and controlled by the enemy, but they were alive and they were in Greece. The gamble seemed to have worked. But as the empty ships were returning to Italy, disaster struck. Pompeius, alerted to Caesar's landing, discovered what was happening. His fleet, furious at being outmaneuvered, mobilized with a vengeance. They descended upon the returning transports and, more importantly, blockaded the Italian coast. Curie, Pompey's fleet mobilized to block the passage of Caesar's ships. Raycroft, Mark Antony, and the rest of the army were trapped in Italy. And Caesar, with only 7 legions, was trapped in Greece. Caesar was completely isolated in Greece. He was no longer the hunter, he was the prey. Pompeius, now fully aware of Caesar's weakened position, took advantage of the situation. Bekwan, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He headed straight for him to stalk his small, cut-off army. Pompey's forces were immense, his supply lines secure. Caesar was in enemy territory with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no escape. The tables had been completely, terrifyingly turned. Caesar knew that this was not the ideal time for a decisive battle. He could not fight Pompey on these terms. His men were veterans, but they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. He needed to gain time. Time for Antony to find a way across. Time to find supplies. Time to change the impossible odds. So he did the one thing he could. He retreated, moving north to the city of Dyrrhachium. It was a strategic port, and Caesar hoped to either capture it or, at the very least, draw Pompey into a siege where his own engineering skills could level the playing field. But Pompeius caught up with him. He did not allow Caesar to rest. He boxed him in, building a vast line of fortifications around Caesar's own siege works. It became a bizarre, protracted struggle, a siege within a siege. Finally, Pompey saw his opening. He launched a massive, coordinated assault. He defeated him at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. It was not a defeat, it was a rout. Caesar's lines, stretched too thin, collapsed. His proud veteran legions, who had never known such a failure, broke and fled. The battle left some 2,000 dead in the enemy ranks, a devastating blow to Caesar's small army. The morale of Caesar's army was in tatters. They had seen their eagle standards fall. They had been humbled. This was the moment. The war was on a knife's edge. Caesar was beaten, his army demoralized, his back to the sea. However, Pompeius failed to seize the opportunity to finish him off for good. However, his officers urged him to charge, to annihilate the fleeing remnants of Caesar's army. But Pompey, ever cautious, hesitated. He mistrusted the scale of his own victory, perhaps fearing a classic Caesarian trap. He called off the pursuit. And in that moment of hesitation, Caesar managed to escape. He gathered what was left of his army and slipped away into the interior of Greece, his reputation and his life hanging by a thread. Pompeius, for his part, retreated south to discuss his next move. He was in a position of undeniable strength. He had defeated the undefeatable. He had proven that Caesar was mortal. His camp was filled with an air of celebration, a dangerous, intoxicating overconfidence. The high-ranking officers, many of them senators and aristocrats who had fled Rome, began to see the war as all but won. Some of these high-ranking officers suggested that Pompeius sail to Italy.
There is no need to chase Caesar any further. We have already won.
With Caesar trapped in Greece, Italy was defenseless. They could retake Rome, cut off all of Caesar's reserves, and end the war by starvation and political collapse. It was a sound strategic move. But Pompeius refused. His refusal was born of a complex mix of pride and pressure. He did not want to be seen as abandoning the glorious task of finishing Caesar in the field. More importantly, his aristocratic allies were hungry for a final, decisive battle that would win them glory and allow them to reclaim their estates. They began to openly mock Pompey's caution, calling him Agamemnon, a king of kings who was dragging out the war for his own pleasure. This internal pressure was building. Meanwhile, Caesar was performing a miracle. He had marched his men into the plains of Thessaly, a region rich in grain. He fed them. He drilled them. He spoke to them, not as a defeated general, but as their commander, their Caesar.
Though the specific words are indistinct.
Do not let
He reminded them of their victories in Gaul.
You are the heroes of Gaul. The eagles remember your triumph.
He spun the defeat at Dyrrhachium not as a failure of their spirit, but a failure of his plan. He took the blame, and in doing so, he reforged their loyalty. Slowly, the tatters of their morale were stitched back together. Their confidence returned, hardened by the shame of their defeat. They were now not just veterans, they were zealots, eager to wash away their disgrace in the blood of the enemy. And with this new terrible resolve, Caesar decided to provoke the decisive battle. Hooray! He no longer had a choice. He had to risk everything on one final throw of the dice. He marched his much smaller army directly towards Pompey's new camp, near the town of Pharsalus. To the surprise and astonishment of Pompeius and the Republicans, they saw Caesar approach with a much smaller army, which they had considered finished. The sight of Caesar's legions marching in perfect formation, ready for battle, was a shock. The overconfidence in Pompey's camp began to curdle, just slightly with a sliver of doubt. Pompeius, however, was a professional. He knew that, despite having the advantage in numbers, Caesar's legionaries were veteran soldiers and much more experienced than his own. His own army was vast, but it was a mix of seasoned troops and green levies recruited from the east. He respected Caesar's men. He knew this would not be easy. But the pressure from his officers was now unbearable.
Victoria nostra est.
Datemi spatium.
They saw Caesar's advance as an act of pure desperation, an insult. They demanded battle. Pompey, against his better judgment, relented. Finally, on August 9th of the same year, the battle that would put an end to the Roman Civil War took place, the Battle of Pharsalus. The day dawned hot and clear. The two greatest Roman generals of their age, once allies, once family, now arrayed their forces against each other. The fate of the known world rested on this one dusty plain. As soon as Pompeius and Caesar had their first eye contact across the field, the dance began. It was a dance of strategy, of iron, and of will. Pompeius's initial move was brilliant in its simplicity and caution. He deployed his legions not on the flat plain, but on the top of a small hill, which put him in an undeniable position. The high ground was his,